Welcome to this first session in our topic on the book of Exodus. We're going to, in this course, go through 6 different books, and Exodus is our first one. Now you might think, well, that's quite the large book to open with, but when you look at the Old Testament story, there's kind of 2 major pillars, 2 things that the whole story really stands on. So, one way to look at it, Genesis opens the story of the Bible, which Revelation closes. The book of Exodus opens the story of the Old Testament, which the prophet Malachi will then close. One of the major events of the book of Exodus is the actual Exodus, Israel leaving Egypt. That's the first pillar of the story of God's people in the Old Testament. Now, the second pillar is the exile, which we'll talk about in our next book, the book of Jeremiah. And so the book of Exodus serves as a foundation for the Old Testament narrative. And so that's why we've picked it. We know that it's a large book to begin with, but as you work through the text, it'll help you understand and place so much more of the rest of the Old Testament story, so that when you're done this brief course, you can go back into books and have a very good, healthy foundation. Now, as we talked about in our session on interpretation, before you enter into a text, you need to prepare yourself with the context, the historical context and the literary context of the book. These are the guardrails that keep us on track when we're trying to interpret our observations. And so, as we go about doing this, in this session, I'm going to share with you the historical context and the literary context of the book of Exodus. Now, this information, when you study other books, you can find them in a study Bible right at the beginning of the book when it says who wrote it and when they wrote it and what's going on, all of that information. And I said the big picture, like the Bible Project on YouTube, they have a ton of videos explaining the big pictures of each book. So I'll share that with you, but for future study, you can find this relatively easy. And that's what you want to do before you go into the text. That's kind of, you're preparing yourself. So, what's the historical context? That's the historical background. What's going on at the time of this book? Well, within the book, we have a few clues, right? It opens with, in chapter 1, it says that the sons of Israel, and then it lists the 12 tribes of Israel. So, to back up on the story, you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the patriarchs. Jacob has 12 sons, and those 12 sons begin to be the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the end of Genesis, they end up in Egypt because of a famine. And now, chapter 1 of Exodus opens up with these 12 tribes, right? About 70 people are in Egypt, but when Exodus opens, they've gone from just the sons of Israel in verse 1 to become the people of Israel in verse 6. And so they're much larger. They're not really a nation, but they've grown in size. Later on in chapter 12, verse 37, the people could be anywhere from 600,000 up to 2 million people. That's a big change from just 70. And it's because they were there for so long. 12, verse 40 of the book of Exodus tells us that they had been in the land for 430 years. Now, they weren't enslaved for that whole time. Exodus 1 verse 8 says that the moment they became enslaved was when a new king rose up who did not know Joseph. Now, this is probably a changing in the Egyptian dynasty, going from the Hyksos people to more of an Egyptian-led nation. And that happens around the 18th dynasty, probably somewhere between a little over 100 years before Israel is actually freed. So they weren't slaves for 400 years, but for at least a quarter of those 400 years, 100 years, they were enslaved, they were oppressed, they were persecuted. And we'll read about why in the opening passages. Now, many scholars will agree that after about 3 generations, your culture kind of dissipates and you blend in with the cultures around you. Think of your own nation, right? And people that immigrate to your nation. after how many generations would they really feel as though they're a part of that language in their culture, in their food, in their language, in their dress? Cultures assimilate. Now, if that happens in roughly 3 generations, right, give or take, that would be about 60 years. What would have happened to the identity of the Hebrew people after they had been in Egypt for 430 years? There's going to be some confusion and uncertainty of who you are. I mean, take a look at one of the opening stories in Exodus 2:19. That's where Moses saves the women shepherds out in the wilderness, and they mistake him for an Egyptian, right? So even within the text, you see that the nations around can't distinguish between an Egyptian and a Hebrew. And so, for sure, and that's because they've lived there for 400 years. And we'll see in the coming sessions that Israel itself needed some dramatic signs to convince them that they were different, that they were set apart from the Egyptian people. Again, because after 400 years, the lines are going to be a little bit blurred. But not only did the people not really know who they were, there's also in the opening passages of Exodus an uncertainty about who God is. All right? Moses, I think it's his second excuse at the burning bush, he says, okay, I'll go back and talk to them, but I need to know what's your name, right? Because up until now, Israel had known God as the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It says this in Exodus chapter 6. And one of the key descriptions of the God of our father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is that he's El Shaddai, God Almighty. Now that word God is a relatively generic term that many other cultures and religions at the time used to refer to their gods. And so Moses is saying, okay, God, we recognize that you are the God of our fathers, kind of our tribal deity almost, but how do you relate to the pantheon or the many gods of the Egyptian people? Because after 400 years, they would have seen the gods of Egypt and learned about who those gods were and what they were responsible for. And God's people need to learn, how does God fit into that worldview? And notice in chapter 5, when God shows up, or when Moses goes for the first time back to Pharaoh to ask for the rescue and the deliverance of his people, Pharaoh's first response is, who is the Lord? Who is Yahweh? He uses God's unique name that is revealed in the book of Exodus, saying, I've never heard of this God before. I don't know who this God is. And so the opening passages bring up this sense of confusion. Not only who are we, who are the Hebrew people, but also who is God. The Egyptians don't know who Yahweh is, the God of Israel. And even Israel itself, they're uncertain, how does Yahweh relate to these other gods? Because if you're a slave, you have a very confusing question to answer, right? If our God is all-powerful and watching over us, then how come we're enslaved? How come the gods of our masters seem to be more powerful than our own God? And so that's what's happening at the beginning of this book. God has not done so much for the people for 400 years. I mean, in chapter 1, it tells us of his rescuing and saving work once they are beginning to be oppressed. But what new stories did they have? The Bible doesn't give them to us. And so after these 400 years, God kind of returns to the people, if you will. And it says that in chapter 2, right? 2 verse 24. It says, God heard their groaning, God remembered his covenant, God saw and God knew. This is the initial list of God's positive action for his people after a very long time. And so God now, in Exodus, we have to understand that God's coming to display and reveal who he is to the people. That's one of the primary things to understand from the historical context. Now, what evidence do we have that the people were a little bit confused other than Moses' questions and Pharaoh's questions? Well, one of the more famous stories in the book of Exodus happens much later on in chapter 32. Now, this is the famous story of the golden calf, right? You remember Moses is up on the mountain and he's up there for a very long time, and the people think that he's dead and gone. And so they, in the kind of the first moment they have to display their belief in Yahweh and to worship God, what do? Well, they build an idol. They build an image of a golden calf. Now, where did they get that idea from? It's not as if, according to Aaron's story, which is false, they didn't just chuck the stuff in the fire and then it came out as this image, right? It specifically says in verse 4, they fashioned it. Of chapter 32, they purposefully made it look like a cow. Why? Well, for 400 years, that's what they had seen displayed and modeled, that there are gods of the world and they have an image. They look like a cow, or they look like a frog, or they look like the sky or the sun. These were all images that would have been pounded into their psyche for 400 years. And so the first moment they get to worship, obviously the first step is you create an image. Now notice this in verse 5. When Aaron saw the golden calf, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." Meaning they weren't worshiping some Egyptian god. Even though maybe it looked like an Egyptian god, they weren't. The idol, the golden calf, somehow was a representation of Yahweh. One commentator put it like this: Yahweh was not being replaced, but rather he was being represented. Now, we'll get into, when we look at the Ten Commandments, why that is such a problem, but this just goes to show that they're thinking like Egyptian people. They're worshiping not just Egyptian people, but they're worshiping the way that the world worshipped back then. Now, these are the people that are coming out of the land, the people that have this distorted worldview because of what they've grown up in for 400 years. But the book of Exodus is also written down for the future generations, the generations that didn't live in Egypt. But this future generation is going to go live in the land of Canaan. Now, Canaan is full of people groups that worship different gods. And they would have for sure impacted Israel's understanding of Yahweh the same way Egypt impacted Israel's understanding of Yahweh. And so there's a few major differences between Egypt and Canaan. This is where geographical context can become important in biblical studies. One of the most important things about Egypt, and we'll come back to this in the coming sessions as well, is the Nile. One of the biggest, if not the biggest river in the world. It's the source of life for the Egyptian people. Still today, they sing songs about how the Nile is the source of life. And so as a result, because the Nile would flood and would water the crops, and that was how they survived. And so they would worship the god of the Nile as like a fertility god, one that would bless their crops and bless their cattle to produce more offspring, and even bless their women to produce more children. Now in Canaan, they didn't have the massive Nile River. They just had a small, tiny river, the River Jordan. And there was a few farms that could be irrigated by the River Jordan in the Jordan Valley. But most of Israel is rocky hill land. And so the only way to farm in those kind of places is to be dependent on rain. Now we see this because some of the major gods of the Canaanite people have to do with rain. One of the most famous is the god Baal, B-A-A-L, okay? And that's the god of storm. If you remember the story of Elijah fighting the prophets of Baal, they're asking whichever God is real will send lightning, will send fire from heaven. That's lightning. And they're doing that because Baal is responsible for storm. Meaning, what comes with storm obviously is rain. So if you worship Baal in the right way, you would get rain. Another god in their religion is Dagon, who is actually the father of Baal, and Dagon is the Hebrew word for grain. So it all associated around worshiping the gods in a right way, so that you can be fertile. Your crops can be fertile. The rain can come because they were farming communities. Your cattle will be blessed. Even the wombs of the women in your community will be blessed. Now, you can see this when God promises to bless his people for their obedience in Exodus 23. Okay? Exodus 23, verse 25. It says, "You shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water. I will take away your sickness from among you. None of you shall miscarry or be barren in the land. I will fulfill the number of your days." God is promising to make them fertile and bless them. Now notice, in the context, the verses just before, he says, do not do what the Canaanites do. Do not bow to their gods in verse 24, right? Don't go to them for your source of security and provision and protection. Rather, worship me. And so, again, they're not going to do that unless they understand who Yahweh is. And so the book of Exodus, some major things need to happen for them to have this revelation, this self-disclosure of who God is, that they're actually willing to trust him, because God was asking them to live very differently than the people around them. Now, it's easy for us to read the story of the Israelite people and say, well, that's a no-brainer. Like, why would you worship those false gods when you saw the plagues and you saw the Red Sea and you saw the pillar of fire by day or by night and the pillar of cloud by day? Why would you worship these other gods? Now, when you approach the Bible and think this way, it shows that you're not really prepared to make interpretation. If you can't understand why the biblical characters made the errors they did and why you're prone and are making the same errors, then you're going to struggle to make the interpretation. But if you've put yourself in their shoes and put yourself in their context and understand, well, of course, Israel, this is a challenging task that God has set before them. He's not just saying, don't worship the gods of the land. He's saying, don't farm like they do. Don't farm like the rest of the world farms. Don't raise your children the way the rest of the world raises their children. Don't get your security and protection and provision the way the rest of the world gets theirs and the way you've seen modeled for 400 years. That's not so easy. I mean, take a look at your own life today. How much of your life is guided by your current culture? How much of your definition of success and security is shaped by what your culture says is success and security? So when we think like this, all of a sudden the Old Testament becomes a lot more dramatic and a lot more applicable, because we see that, wow, Israel is in the same struggle against the current cultural trends as I am today. And when you do that, then you're ready to make interpretation because you understand the historical context and you're interpreting the Bible in the shoes of the original readers. Then you can make your application. And so that's why it's important. We need to understand that what God's doing at the time is God's setting apart a people for himself from the rest of the world that doesn't know Yahweh. Now, why is he doing that? We're going to look at that in the coming sessions. So within the book, as you make interpretations, you need to understand two things. One, what did it mean to the original hearers, right? What were people thinking when God told them to build the tabernacle this certain way? Or when they come out of Egypt and around the corner in the wilderness and they see God on Mount Sinai, what were they thinking? So these are the original hearers, the eyewitnesses of these accounts. But we know that Moses, there was a book being written at the time, and Moses was probably easily the most educated one at the time, being raised in the house of Pharaoh. So he was writing down these stories as they happened, at least from Exodus onwards. And he's writing them down for the generation that will go into Canaan. And so that's the other half of our interpretation. Well, why would he write this story down? And what would this story mean as they enter into Canaan? What would the story of the plagues have meant to the people as they read it and they enter into Canaan? What hope would come from that? And as we think through that, the original hearers, as well as the original readers, that's the basis for our interpretation. What did it mean to those people back then and there? The readers and the hearers. So that's our historical context. And we're going to come back to that again and again as we work through the text. Now, as for the literary context, remember we had two guardrails. One was the historical context, which we've just looked at, and the other is now the literary context. What's the big picture of the book? And then when you know that, you can be looking at a single passage, a single paragraph, or even verse and think, how does this relate to the overall story? Now, there's a couple ways that we can organize this, and it's helpful to understand a verse that kind of holds this all together. Exodus 29, verse 46. This is what some would call the key verse or the central message or main idea of the book of Exodus. Exodus 29, verse 46. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. So you have two parts. You have that God wants to bring them out of Egypt so that he can dwell among them. And you can structure the book according to this passage in a couple of ways. You can take chapter 1 to chapter 118. That details the bringing out of Egypt. It details the rescue. Okay. Then at chapter 19, they arrive at Mount Sinai, and that's where God begins to speak about dwelling in their midst. So if you take a look at verse 46, the first half of that is describing chapters 1 to 18. Give you the big picture. And then the second half of verse 46 is describing the later half of the book, from chapters 19 all the way up until chapter 40. And so there you have themes of rescue and covenant. And so you can divide the book based on these two major themes. Another way to divide it is to look more at kind of the geographical separation. So you have the first 15 chapters occurring in Egypt and at the Red Sea. And then you have from chapters 16 on to 40 occurring in the wilderness. So you could also divide the book to Egypt and the specific purposes that God has for Egypt, which has to do with rescue and revelation of who God is. And then you can divide it into the later half in the wilderness from 16 to 40, and that has to do not so much with rescue, but more of God revealing himself to his own people and the purposes of God to dwell amongst them. So if you want to know what the book of Exodus is about, you can quickly read that passage. It's about God bringing them out of Egypt that he might dwell among them. And that you can easily break the book into two large chunks. Okay? So in a real sense, the story of the Exodus is the story of God rescuing slaves from Egypt and turning them into sons that he's going to dwell with. It's a story of slavery to sonship. And it's a drastic narrative of this incredible transformation. It's a display of God's redemptive power, creating order from chaos, bringing light from the darkness, moving people from death to life. It's a journey. And so I encourage you to buckle up and join with us as we go into the narrative of Exodus. And we'll also, along the way, find ourselves in the story as a jumping point for our application. Now, I know Exodus is a large book, 40 chapters. It takes about 3 hours to read in one sitting. But I want to encourage you, as you move into the coming sessions, to take a moment and read the whole book of Exodus. It helps if you read it out loud because it helps you focus on the text. Don't get bogged down by making a ton of observations. Just you want to get the bigger picture. Like I said, the Exodus to Egypt to wilderness, or rescue to covenant. You want to see those larger pictures before we dive into individual passages in the text. Reading from 1 to 40 in one go is like, I've said it earlier, it's like flying over a country at 30,000 feet. You don't really know what it's like down there, but you have the big picture. So I want to encourage you to try to read through Exodus in a couple sittings, one if you can, or a few more, and not really thinking and taking notes, but just getting the big picture. This is a basic observation task.